You're tuned in to 22 Crime, where the truth hides in the details. Together we dive into the darkest corners of human nature, exploring the mysteries that have left investigators puzzled and families searching for justice. Because in the world of crime, the truth is never as simple as it seems. We're here to discuss the life, career, and tragic end of Dr. Amy Harwick, a woman who dedicated herself to helping others, offering comfort and healing to those battling the darkest parts of their lives. Amy was a celebrated therapist, author, and advocate, deeply loved by those who knew her and respected in her community. But despite her work to understand and support people through their trauma, she became a victim herself, and her life was cut short in a way that reveals serious gaps in how we handle cases of domestic violence and stalking. Amy's story is more than a tale of success or tragedy. It's a call to examine how we, as a society, deal with the persistent threats posed by domestic abuse and obsessive, violent behavior. Today, we will unravel the events leading up to her untimely death, exploring the warnings, the dangers, and the lessons her story brings to light. Before we go further, we want to extend our deepest sympathies to Amy's loved ones and everyone impacted by her passing. Sharing her story is one way we honor her memory, advocating for awareness and understanding around the issues she, unfortunately, could not escape. This episode delves into her life with sensitivity and respect, and I hope that by telling her story, we can illuminate the pressing need for action in protecting those vulnerable to similar threats. So, join us as we journey into Amy's world, a life marked by resilience and compassion, and a tragedy that, while painfully unique, reflects a broader societal struggle. This is Amy Harwick's story. The clock is ticking. Let's uncover the truth behind today's mystery. Viewer discretion is advised. 22 is a true crime podcast that delves into real-life crime stories, which often involve graphic descriptions, sensitive content, and strong language that may not be suitable for all audiences. We strive to present these cases with the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Please note that the content discussed may be distressing or triggering for some listeners. Additionally, all resources and information presented in this podcast are obtained from publicly available internet sources. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and we recommend that only mature audiences proceed with caution. If you are sensitive to such content, please consider watching another video. Stay safe and take care of your mental health. To understand the gravity of Amy Harwick's story, it's essential to look at who she was, beyond the headlines and beyond the final, tragic chapter of her life. Amy was a truly complex individual, one who wore many hats, who broke boundaries, and who made a difference in countless lives. Let's start at the beginning, with her roots in Sellersville, Pennsylvania, where Amy was born on May 20, 1981. Amy was adopted as an infant by Tom and Penny Harwick, who lovingly brought her into their family when she was just 11 months old. Amy's early life in Pennsylvania was, by most accounts, a happy one. Her parents described her as a bright, curious, and fiercely independent young girl, a child with a strong will and boundless energy. She had a mischievous streak and a thirst for adventure, traits that only grew stronger as she got older. Amy had one sibling, her brother Chris, who was also adopted. She loved Chris, though family friends recall that she had a humorous way of showing it. When she was just 4 years old and Chris came home, Amy asked her parents a question that only a little child could. "When is he going back?" Her parents chuckled and reassured her, telling her, "He's your brother, and he's here to stay." This tight-knit family formed a strong foundation for Amy, nurturing her interests and encouraging her ambition. Growing up, she was deeply creative, exploring everything from music to the arts, even developing a fascination with psychology at a young age. As a teenager, she started showing signs of what would become a lifelong attraction to the darker, mysterious side of life. She loved rock music, had an early interest in true crime, and gravitated toward anything that defied convention. By the time Amy graduated high school in 1999, she had set her sights on big dreams. She was someone who had a vision for her life, a life of independence and excitement, and she wanted to make a meaningful impact. Her friends and family all knew she was destined for something significant. And she knew that to chase those dreams, she would have to leave Pennsylvania and head west to Los Angeles. In her early 20s, Amy made that move. She left behind the familiar streets of Pennsylvania and set out to carve a new path in Los Angeles. Once she arrived in California, she enrolled at California Polytechnic State University, where she earned a degree in psychology, but Amy was just getting started. Soon after, she began her master's degree at Pepperdine University, one of the top psychology programs in the country. It was a rigorous path, but she thrived in it. Her time in academia reflected a new level of maturity, discipline, and purpose, something she would carry with her throughout her career. After earning her master's, Amy went even further, pursuing a PhD in human sexuality at the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality. This field was one of her true passions. She studied extensively to understand and treat complex issues around intimacy, sexuality, and mental health, and she emerged from this journey as Dr. Amy Harwick, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a specialty in sex therapy. But Amy's professional life was about so much more than a title or the degrees on her wall. She was a true healer, someone who deeply cared for others and sought to make a difference in ways that many in her field would consider unconventional. Her clients describe her as compassionate, down-to-earth, and incredibly perceptive. She didn't just listen, she empathized. She made her clients feel seen, understood, and supported, helping them work through some of the darkest and most difficult periods of their lives. She also extended her services to those who often struggle to find non-judgmental support, especially in the mental health space. Amy worked with individuals in the adult film industry, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and those with marginalized sexual identities. She was determined to provide a safe space for people who were often stigmatized, ensuring they had access to the mental health services they needed. But Amy Harwick was more than just her career. She lived a colorful and, at times, unconventional life. In many ways, she was a study in contrasts. By day, she was the well-regarded Dr. Harwick, a professional therapist who appeared on television, in interviews, and even on her own YouTube channel to discuss mental health topics with authority and care. By night, she was known for her love of Los Angeles' goth and rock scenes. She frequented go-go clubs, loved dressing in vintage noir-inspired fashion, and even go-go danced herself from time to time. This side of Amy was fascinating, and it showed her dynamic personality. She wasn't afraid to embrace her interest in true crime and the macabre. She found them endlessly intriguing, and friends said it helped her see life's darker side in a way that ultimately made her a better therapist. She was drawn to the unconventional, to the misunderstood, and she brought those qualities into her work, creating a unique connection with her clients that few others could. Amy was also a woman who embraced adventure. She once performed a fire-breathing routine at the Playboy Mansion, an act that speaks to the confidence she carried and the freedom with which she lived her life. She spent her days helping others navigate trauma and hardship, and her nights enjoying the freedom and energy of the Los Angeles scene. She even dated some big names in the music world, including heavy metal icon Marilyn Manson. Friends often said Amy was like no one they had ever met before. She was intelligent, deeply empathetic, and intensely driven, a woman who knew what she wanted and lived life without apologies. Despite her love for the wild side, she remained grounded. She never lost sight of her mission, to help people, to heal, and to inspire. She was, in every sense, a rarity in Hollywood, someone who was as genuine as she was multifaceted. Amy's story could easily have been one of triumph and success. She had overcome her own personal battles, had found a career that she loved, and had built a community around her. But despite her strength, her intuition, and her professional expertise, Amy couldn't escape the one thing that would ultimately overshadow her life: a past relationship with an ex-boyfriend who would one day return in a way she couldn't have foreseen. Her friends described her as a force, a beautiful, caring, compassionate person who saw the best in people and lived without regrets. Amy Harwick was a woman with big dreams, a lot of love to give, and an unwavering dedication to others. Yet for all her strength and resilience, she was not immune to danger. This story is one of the countless reminders that no amount of compassion or empathy can change the intentions of a person bent on harm. As we move into the next part of Amy's story, we look into the relationship that changed her life and ultimately took it away. Amy Harwick's life was dynamic, filled with a vibrant mix of intellectual pursuits, creativity, and personal reinvention. She was celebrated as a compassionate therapist, a driven advocate for the marginalized, and a true force in Hollywood's therapeutic circles. But behind her professional achievements was a personal chapter of darkness and fear, one that began in 2010 when she met a man named Gareth Pursehouse. Gareth was a photographer and an aspiring comedian, working the Hollywood scene just as Amy was gaining traction in her own career. Friends would later describe him as energetic and over the top, someone with a certain charm but an intensity that sometimes bordered on uncomfortable. At first glance, Gareth seemed like a great match, intelligent, creative, and similarly entrenched in LA's eccentric social circles. But as Amy got to know him better, troubling signs began to appear. Gareth's behavior seemed innocent at first, perhaps even endearing. He would frequently mirror Amy's interests, claiming to love everything she did, whether it was her favorite band or her fascination with the macabre. Friends noticed this, recalling how Gareth had a way of adopting her preferences as his own. While mimicking interest might seem trivial, it quickly became apparent that this wasn't mere flattery. It was an early hint of Gareth's fixation, a deep-seated need to attach himself to Amy's life and identity in ways that grew darker with time. Over their 2-year relationship, that seemingly harmless mimicry evolved into something far more concerning. Friends reported that Gareth's attachment quickly became overbearing. He would become jealous of the time she spent with others, especially her male friends. He would send her streams of messages, sometimes demanding to know her whereabouts, her plans, and even her intentions. As one friend described it, he wanted to consume every part of her life. It wasn't long before Gareth's behavior turned physically abusive. Amy documented numerous instances in which Gareth's anger boiled over, leaving her frightened and physically hurt. She would later report to police that he had choked her, thrown her to the ground, and struck her with a closed fist. On one occasion, she alleged he had dragged her from a car, leaving her stranded and vulnerable on the side of the freeway. Gareth's jealousy and desire for control had reached a point where Amy no longer felt safe. In May of 2011, Amy took a critical step. She filed a restraining order against Gareth. She detailed his attacks, described his rage, and expressed her deep-seated fear for her life. She hoped the legal protection would create the distance she so desperately needed, but Gareth's influence over her life didn't stop. Her request for the restraining order was initially denied, a decision that forced her to continue facing his threats and harassment without any legal shield. Finally, in 2012, after another terrifying incident of abuse, Amy succeeded in securing a restraining order. Gareth was officially barred from having any contact with her for 5 years, a period during which he was legally bound to stay away. While the restraining order was in place, Amy tried to rebuild her life, refocusing her energy on her work and her community, but Gareth's presence lingered in her mind. The order provided a sense of physical security, but the psychological scars were not so easily erased. For Gareth, those 5 years of enforced distance didn't seem to weaken his obsession. By the time the order expired in 2017, he had spent nearly a decade ruminating on their brief relationship. Amy, on the other hand, had moved forward, finding new love and advancing in her career, becoming a recognized voice in therapy and the support of marginalized communities. But Gareth hadn't moved on. Friends recall Amy mentioning her fear of Gareth even years after their breakup. She'd found her home broken into multiple times, with her laptop wiped clean and photo albums mysteriously taken. Though she couldn't prove Gareth was responsible, the unnerving feeling lingered, and her friends shared her suspicion. This chapter of Amy's life not only took a toll on her emotionally, but also had lasting impacts on her professional world. Gareth's threats, whether direct or implied, placed a shadow over her well-being, leading her to think twice about every new relationship and career move. Amy even lost a job at one point when provocative photos of her were anonymously sent to her employer, a cruel tactic that she believed was Gareth's attempt to sabotage her career. Amy shared her fears with close friends and family, letting them know that if anything happened to her, Gareth would likely be the cause. She spoke about the deep sense of foreboding that clouded her thoughts. This wasn't paranoia. It was the well-founded fear of a woman who knew, better than anyone, the lengths that Gareth might go to. Despite these fears, Amy chose to press forward. She continued her work with clients, advocating for those in need and devoting herself to her practice. But she lived with the haunting reality that even after the restraining order ended, the specter of Gareth Pursehouse loomed. In the years that followed, she took steps to protect herself, from changing her locks to considering new safety measures. Amy knew that Gareth's obsession was unlikely to simply vanish, and she was right. When she saw him unexpectedly at a public event nearly 8 years after they had last spoken, her worst fears reignited in a way she could never have prepared for. By January 2020, it had been nearly a decade since Amy Harwick had last seen Gareth Pursehouse. Their relationship was a distant, haunting memory for her, marked by trauma and fear. But in those years, Amy had risen above that dark period, focusing on her career, her clients, and her calling to help others. She had done everything she could to leave Gareth in the past, yet sometimes, the past finds a way back. It was a glitzy evening in Los Angeles at the JW Marriott Hotel. Amy was attending the XBiz Awards, a high-profile event in the adult film industry where she was scheduled to speak on behalf of Pineapple Support, a mental health organization for sex workers. She arrived in good spirits, dressed impeccably, her signature charm lighting up the red carpet. But as she mingled with friends and prepared for her segment, Amy's world suddenly turned on its head. In a chance, perhaps fateful, encounter, she saw Gareth. There he was, working the event as a photographer. Neither had planned to be there, but fate had brought them both to the same place, almost 10 years since they last saw each other. Witnesses would later describe how Gareth seemed to transform when he saw her. The once subdued, almost invisible photographer suddenly erupted with emotion. As he spotted her, Gareth's face contorted in anger. He approached Amy with a look of fury and pain, and his words, sharp and venomous, cut through the noisy crowd. "You ruined my life," he accused, his voice loud enough to turn heads. The gathering of Hollywood socialites, photographers and guests paused, their eyes on Amy and the man who seemed to be unraveling in front of her. For nearly 45 minutes Gareth berated Amy, hurling accusations and bitter remarks. His voice was filled with a strange, unyielding desperation as he replayed the past. He brought up old texts, reading them back to her as though they were proof of her supposed betrayal. Amy stood there, frozen in a mix of fear and shock. She tried to de-escalate, using every bit of her therapist training to calm him down, but Gareth's emotional state was beyond reasoning. His words were filled with bitterness, anger, and a disturbing fixation on events that had happened years ago. Witnesses would later recall seeing Amy visibly shaken, struggling to keep her composure. She tried to pull him aside to avoid creating a scene, but Gareth only grew more intense. His words echoed in her mind long after he walked away, leaving her feeling exposed and deeply unsettled. Friends at the event saw her distress and quickly gathered around to comfort her. As she left the venue, Amy could not shake the feeling that Gareth's obsession with her had never faded. If anything, it seemed more powerful, more dangerous than ever before. That night, Amy returned home and began putting her fear into action. She knew better than to ignore the signs. She immediately reached out to her friends, expressing her fears in no uncertain terms. "If anything happens to me," she told them, "it will be Gareth." She knew that the restraining order she had once secured was long expired, and this chance encounter had only reignited her dread of what he might be capable of. Amy confided in her close friend, Robert Koshland, describing Gareth's emotional outburst in painful detail. She told him that Gareth had seemed almost unhinged, his anger not just directed at her but somehow rooted in the idea that she was to blame for all the pain he felt. Gareth's obsession was no longer hidden. It was explosive, unpredictable, and Amy couldn't ignore the mounting dread that followed her home that night. But Amy wasn't one to just sit idly by. She was proactive, thoughtful, and determined to take back control over her own safety. Within days, she began implementing a security plan, first by arranging to install new locks on her doors. She invested in a security system, including cameras, and reached out to a handyman to assess every possible point of entry around her home. One friend described her as practical but scared. Amy even went so far as to purchase pepper spray, feeling that every small measure might somehow give her a sliver of control, a sense of preparedness. She reached out to her mother, Penny, and they set up location sharing on their phones, so her family would always know where she was. The once confident Amy was now living in a state of hyper-awareness, haunted by the feeling that Gareth was somewhere, watching, waiting. But Gareth was not done. Shortly after the awards event, he tracked down her number and began sending her messages. His texts carried the same obsessive tone he had shown that night at the event. At first, he pleaded for a chance to talk, for her to listen to what he needed to say. But as the days wore on, the messages grew darker, the tone shifting from desperation to a simmering anger. Amy felt torn. Despite her lingering empathy, she knew Gareth was dangerous, unpredictable, and so, finally, she made a firm decision. She blocked him, cutting off any remaining ties, refusing to allow his words into her world any longer. Blocking him felt empowering, a final step in reclaiming her life and saying, enough. But what Amy didn't know was that, in doing so, she may have triggered something even more dangerous. For Gareth, that last block was a turning point. It was as if Amy's silence, her refusal to engage with him, only intensified his fixation. She had been his obsession for nearly a decade, and her rejection now seemed to push him to an even darker place. Amy had done all she could to protect herself. She had reached out to friends and family, fortified her home, and made her fears clear. Yet, for Gareth, the finality of her silence was the catalyst. He was no longer content with distance, with old memories or chance encounters. Gareth Pursehouse's obsession had grown, festering into something that no door, no camera, no pepper spray could contain. In the days that followed, Amy continued her life as best she could, hoping that her proactive steps would keep her safe. But for Gareth, Amy's refusal to answer him was an unspoken declaration. It was the push that would soon bring both of them to a final, terrifying confrontation. It was the evening of February 14, 2020, Valentine's Day, a day that should have been filled with joy, but for Amy Harwick, it would tragically be her last. Amy had spent the evening with friends, enjoying a burlesque show in Los Angeles. Her friend, known as Miss Tosh, was performing, and the show was the perfect way for Amy to unwind. She was vibrant and full of energy, surrounded by friends, laughter, and music. Amy's friends later recalled how she appeared that night, dressed elegantly, smiling, and genuinely happy. It was an evening that gave her a brief reprieve from the lingering fears she harbored after her recent encounter with Gareth. After the show, Amy and her friends continued their night at the upscale Nomad Hotel for tea and conversation. They reminisced, shared stories, and took photos to remember the night. At some point, Amy was even seen wearing rosary beads with a crucifix, something friends later described as unusual, as if she felt the need for an extra layer of protection. At around 1 a.m., Amy bid her friends goodbye and returned to her Hollywood Hills home, nestled in one of LA's most iconic neighborhoods. She sent her final text message at precisely 1:01 a.m., but only minutes later, her peaceful home would be the setting for a horror no one could have predicted. Inside her home, Michael Herman, Amy's roommate, was sound asleep in his downstairs bedroom. Michael had been accustomed to Amy's late nights and paid no mind when he heard her footsteps entering the house, but then the calm shattered. A loud noise jolted him awake, something that sounded like glass shattering or a heavy object hitting the floor. At first, he assumed Amy might have dropped something or that her cat had knocked something over. He tried to drift back to sleep, but what he heard next would haunt him forever. Piercing through the quiet, Michael heard a scream, a desperate, blood-curdling scream from Amy's upstairs bedroom. He described it later as unlike anything he had ever heard before, the kind of scream that instantly sends chills down your spine. It was the sound of pure terror. Realizing the urgency of the situation, Michael searched frantically for his phone to call for help, but in the chaos, he couldn't find it. Desperate, he tried shouting up the stairs to scare the intruder away, yelling, "Leave her alone!" hoping his voice would somehow be enough to make them stop. The struggle continued, punctuated by Amy's screams and muffled sounds of violence. Michael made the heartbreaking decision to leave the house to seek help, realizing that he might be Amy's only hope. Racing to the front door, he realized it was locked. The only way out was through the back, where he faced a tall metal fence with sharp spiked rods at the top. With adrenaline coursing through him, Michael scaled the fence, cutting his hands and arms as he climbed over, leaving streaks of blood in his wake. Once on the other side, he sprinted to the neighboring houses, pounding on doors, frantically shouting for someone to call 911. As he banged on doors, he finally found a neighbor who opened the door and handed him a phone. At precisely 1:16 a.m., the Los Angeles Police Department responded to Michael's desperate call. By the time officers arrived, Michael was outside, frantic, bloodied from his climb over the fence. He tried to explain to them what he had heard and the terror he had felt. But his mind was spinning, and his words came out in frantic bursts. Officers quickly directed him to sit down, urging him to calm down as they moved to enter the house. The police entered through the back of the property, winding through the darkened paths, their flashlights cutting through the eerie silence. In the courtyard, just beneath Amy's third-story balcony, they found her. Amy's body lay crumpled on the ground, surrounded by shattered glass, her broken rosary beads scattered around her as if they had been ripped from her neck in a violent struggle. She was unresponsive, her breathing shallow, and she was barely clinging to life. Police noted the visible bruising around her neck, a grim sign that she had been strangled before the fall. Despite their efforts to revive her, Amy's injuries were too severe. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but within hours, she was pronounced dead. Her injuries told a devastating story, blunt force trauma from the fall and, as the autopsy would later reveal, evidence of strangulation. As detectives began to piece together the events, they conducted a thorough search of the house. In Amy's bedroom, they discovered overturned furniture, a broken glass panel in the French doors, and bloodstains on the floor, a clear sign of a violent struggle. The door's broken lock confirmed that the intruder had forced his way inside, likely through those very doors that Amy had intended to secure after her frightening encounter with Gareth only a month before. The most chilling discovery, however, was found on the balcony where Amy had been attacked. Amidst the scattered beads and broken glass, investigators noticed an unusual object, a medium-sized syringe filled with a yellowish-brown liquid that would later be identified as liquid nicotine. In high concentrations, nicotine is a powerful toxin, capable of causing paralysis and death within minutes. The presence of the syringe indicated a dark and disturbing possibility. Whoever attacked Amy had come prepared to kill. The pieces of evidence, the broken lock, the syringe, the bruises, and the bloodied doors, painted a horrific picture of that night. It became clear to investigators that this was no random burglary gone wrong. This was a meticulously planned attack, an ambush designed to catch Amy off guard in her own home on a day meant for love and affection. The brutality and precision of the assault left little doubt in the minds of investigators. They suspected that this was the work of someone who had harbored a deep obsession, someone who had been consumed by rage and rejection. As dawn broke over the Hollywood Hills, Amy's home, once a place of warmth and refuge, was now a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape. News of her tragic death sent shockwaves through her circle of friends, clients, and the Hollywood community. But for those closest to her, one name immediately surfaced in their minds, a name that had haunted Amy's life for nearly a decade. Investigators, too, were quick to pick up on this lead. With a profile emerging, they started to trace every connection, every moment of fear, and every encounter that Amy had endured over the years with Gareth Pursehouse. The evidence, chilling and irrefutable, painted a grim picture of Gareth's possible involvement. But now, the police had a daunting task before them, to locate Gareth and hold him accountable for the night that shattered so many lives. Amy's life had been dedicated to helping others, to creating a world where people could feel safe, loved, and understood. And yet, In her final moments, she had faced the very thing she had tried to help others escape, an all-consuming, violent obsession that would end in the most tragic way imaginable. As dawn rose over the Hollywood Hills on February 15, 2020, police were already knee-deep in the investigation of Amy Harwick's brutal murder. The scene they left behind spoke of a calculated, violent crime, but now detectives needed answers. Who would have the obsession, the planning, and the twisted motivation to break into her home and end her life in such a horrifying way? The first place investigators looked was into Amy's recent history, speaking with friends, neighbors, and her closest confidants. Within hours, a name surfaced from almost every person they interviewed: Gareth Pursehouse. Friends like Robert Koshland, who had known Amy for years, painted a picture of Gareth as the dark figure looming in Amy's past. He was someone Amy had feared, someone who had harbored a dangerous obsession with her, and just 1 month before her death, she had run into him unexpectedly at a Hollywood event. That interaction had shaken her to the core. Amy's friends recalled how she had shared her fears and concerns about Gareth after that night, detailing his hostile behavior and threats. Armed with this lead, detectives quickly shifted their focus to Gareth Pursehouse. Their first stop was to gather any physical evidence they could link to him, beginning with a thorough examination of Amy's property. And it wasn't long before their suspicions started to solidify. In reviewing surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera, police caught sight of a lone figure approaching Amy's home hours before she arrived back that night. The man was dressed in black, gloved, and wore a hood to obscure his face, but his movements were distinctive. The footage showed him disabling Amy's security cameras and entering her property under the cover of darkness, clear evidence that whoever had come that night had planned their intrusion meticulously. While the footage didn't capture his face clearly, police felt that it was only a matter of time before they confirmed his identity. But the most damning piece of evidence was discovered on Amy's balcony: the syringe filled with liquid nicotine, a highly toxic substance that could cause death within minutes if injected. This syringe wasn't something one would simply find on the street. It suggested premeditation, a deliberate choice by the assailant to inflict pain or death on Amy. To the police, this indicated that the intruder hadn't come to talk, steal, or frighten. He had come to kill. The syringe, fingerprints, and blood evidence from the broken glass were sent to a forensic lab. Within days, the DNA results came back, a match to Gareth Pursehouse. The police now had scientific proof linking him to Amy's home on the night of her murder. With this undeniable evidence, detectives moved swiftly, locating Gareth's residence in Playa del Rey. Within 13 hours of Amy's death, officers surrounded his neighborhood and arrested him. But even as they closed in on Gareth, his behavior was odd. He initially feigned ignorance, claiming to know nothing about what had happened to Amy. When detectives asked about the scratches on his hands and the bruising on his face, he laughed it off, attributing the injuries to a home renovation accident. Detectives knew better. These were not the marks of a careless handyman. They were fresh wounds likely sustained during a struggle. During their search of his home, detectives discovered items that were both disturbing and incriminating. They found syringes identical to the one found on Amy's balcony, each preloaded with liquid nicotine. Gareth's obsession with Amy had not only persisted over the years, it had become darker, more menacing, and lethal. To the investigators, these syringes told a chilling story. He had been planning this, perhaps not for weeks or months, but for years. There were also traces of blood on clothing he'd attempted to wash and destroy, bloodstains that matched Amy's DNA. With each new piece of evidence, the case against Gareth became more airtight. The police had painted a clear portrait of a man whose fixation had spiraled from infatuation to pure malice, a man who had taken meticulous steps to ensure he would have the tools needed to end her life. But the most unsettling part came after Gareth's arrest. His behavior in jail was unnerving, even for seasoned detectives. In recorded phone calls with friends from jail, Gareth displayed a chilling lack of remorse. He laughed, joked, and even seemed to revel in the media attention he was receiving. For those who knew Amy, this was incomprehensible. The man she had once loved, who had claimed to be heartbroken over her, was now in jail, laughing, treating her murder as if it were some strange kind of joke. In one conversation, he even suggested to his friends that they could sell his belongings for a profit, since, as he put it, his name was now worth something. This phone call was more than just unsettling. It spoke volumes to the detectives about Gareth's character. His laughter, his dismissal of Amy's life, his clear lack of regret, all of it painted him as someone who had not just committed a murder, but was disturbingly indifferent to the consequences. When these calls were later used in court, the prosecution argued that they showed Gareth's true nature, a man so consumed by rage and obsession that he couldn't see beyond his own twisted needs. His attitude only reinforced the case against him. For the jury, it was the final confirmation of the type of person who had taken Amy Harwick's life, a man devoid of empathy, consumed by a dark obsession that he would see through to the end, regardless of the cost. As the investigation wrapped up, the pieces had finally fallen into place. With DNA, surveillance footage, and Gareth's own incriminating words, detectives had pieced together a chilling story. Amy Harwick, a woman whose life was dedicated to helping others, had been taken by the very darkness she had spent her career fighting against. In Gareth Pursehouse, the investigators saw not just a man scorned, but a man whose obsession had crossed all boundaries, blinding him to empathy and reason. For Amy's family, friends, and loved ones, the investigation's conclusion brought both relief and sorrow. They had found the man responsible, but they had also uncovered the terrifying extent to which one person's fixation could destroy so many lives. Gareth Pursehouse would now face the full weight of the law, but for those who loved Amy, the memory of her tragic end would forever be a haunting reminder of the danger she had lived with, and the man who had finally made good on his dark intentions. It was August of 2023, 3 long years after Amy Harwick's tragic death, and the Los Angeles Superior Court was filled with people eager to witness the beginning of a high-profile trial, the people via Gareth Pursehouse. From friends and family to reporters and the wider public, everyone had the same question: would justice finally be served for Amy? As the trial began, prosecutors presented a meticulous case against Gareth Pursehouse, outlining the years of obsession, the stalking, and the malicious intent that culminated in Amy's death on that Valentine's night in 2020. Victor Avila, the deputy district attorney, led the prosecution with an unyielding stance, declaring that Amy had not simply fallen to her death, but had been the victim of a planned, brutal murder by a man who had refused to let her go. They argued that Gareth had carefully calculated his actions and meticulously planned his entry, using the syringe as evidence of his intent to kill. In contrast, the defense painted a vastly different picture. Gareth's lawyer, Evan Franzel, claimed that his client had been driven to a deep, debilitating depression after unexpectedly encountering Amy at an event in January 2020. According to the defense, this meeting had reignited years of unresolved emotions, leading Gareth into what they framed as an emotional spiral. They argued that Gareth had not come to Amy's home that night to kill her. Instead, they claimed he had been there to talk to her, to seek some kind of closure or forgiveness. The defense admitted he had broken into her home and waited for her, but they claimed his intentions were not malicious. It was a bold defense, but the prosecution was ready. They didn't buy the notion that Gareth had broken into her home, disabled security cameras, and entered in the dead of night only to talk. For Victor Avila and his team, this was no cry for help. It was cold-blooded murder. The prosecution began piecing together a damning timeline, starting from that fateful meeting in January at the Adult Industry Awards event. Gareth had confronted Amy there, loudly accusing her of ruining his life. He'd become unhinged in public, so much so that Amy's friends had rushed to her side, witnessing his disturbing behavior. And in the days that followed, his anger only grew. The prosecution argued that this rage had reached a tipping point when Amy blocked his number, closing the door on any further communication. With surveillance footage, text messages, and testimonies, the prosecution showed a clear pattern of escalation in Gareth's behavior. Witnesses, including Amy's friends and family, took the stand to describe the fear she had felt in those final days. Her close friend, Robert Koshland, recounted Amy's concern after seeing Gareth in January, revealing how she had even shared her phone's location with him as a safety measure. He recalled her words as they left a haunting impact on the courtroom. Then came Michael Herman, Amy's roommate, who testified about the events of that horrific night. He recounted being awakened by Amy's screams and hearing the unmistakable sounds of a struggle in her room. He described the fear, the desperation, and his struggle to find help. The jury sat in rapt silence, many of them visibly moved, as Michael recounted the harrowing moments leading up to her tragic fall from the balcony. But the most chilling evidence came from Gareth himself. The prosecution played recorded phone calls made by Gareth from jail in which he joked about his newfound fame and casually discussed selling his belongings to cash in on the media attention. His cold, detached laughter and utter lack of remorse left a lasting impression on the jury, a reminder that this was not a man burdened by guilt or shame. But the defense was not done yet. They made one final attempt to sway the jury, presenting a theory that defied belief. They claimed that in her panic, Amy had somehow climbed over her balcony to escape Gareth and lost her grip, resulting in a tragic accident. To support this narrative, the defense showed an undated photo of Amy posing near a balcony, suggesting that she had no fear of heights. For many in the courtroom, this explanation was a stretch too far. The prosecution argued that this was a desperate attempt to place the blame on Amy herself, painting Gareth as a helpless bystander rather than the aggressor. They urged the jury to see past the defense's theatrics, to the hard evidence, the syringe, the broken door, the surveillance footage, and Gareth's own disturbing words. In their closing arguments, the prosecution read aloud an email Amy had written to herself the night after she encountered Gareth in January, capturing her own fear in her own words. It was the closest the jury would ever come to hearing from Amy herself. The weight of the evidence hung heavy in the courtroom as the jury began deliberations. For 2 days, Amy's family and friends held their breath, waiting for the verdict that would decide whether Gareth Pursehouse would be held accountable. Each hour that passed left her loved ones fearing that somehow he might evade justice. But on the 3rd day, the jury returned, and the room fell silent. The foreman's voice cut through the tension as he read the words everyone had been hoping for. Gareth Pursehouse was found guilty of first-degree murder with a special circumstance of lying in wait, a charge that made him eligible for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in tears, a mix of relief and heartbreak. Amy's family and friends felt the bittersweet triumph of justice served, knowing that while Gareth would never harm anyone again, the void left by Amy's absence would remain forever. Penny and Tom Harwick, Amy's parents, embraced as they finally felt some measure of peace. In December of 2023, Gareth Pursehouse was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He offered no statement, no remorse, only silence as the sentence was handed down. He had been brought to justice, but for those who loved Amy, the pain would never truly go away. Amy's family and friends have turned their sorrow into advocacy, championing for new laws to protect victims of stalking and domestic violence. Their hope is that Amy's story can save others from suffering the same fate. In the end, Amy Harwick's memory lives on, both in the legacy of her work and in the continued fight for justice. Her death has sparked a movement, one that aims to ensure that no one else will have to endure the terror that she faced. As her family and friends remember her, they hold tight to the light she brought into the world, determined that it won't be overshadowed by the darkness that took her away. Her light, her life, and her legacy, they all endure, even as the court finally closes the case on Gareth Pursehouse. Amy's voice may be silent, but her spirit continues to guide those she left behind. Amy Harwick's tragic death was more than just a devastating loss to those who loved her. It was a resounding wake-up call. In the months that followed, her family and friends knew that they couldn't simply grieve in silence. They were determined to honor Amy's legacy in the most impactful way possible, by transforming their pain into action and their heartbreak into hope for others who live in fear of abusive partners and relentless stalkers. As details of Amy's case surfaced, it became painfully clear that despite her efforts, the legal protections in place hadn't been enough. Restraining orders had failed to shield her from Gareth Pursehouse. The legal system had granted her a restraining order back in 2012, but 5 years later it expired, leaving Amy vulnerable. Amy's tragic fate underscored a disturbing reality. Once a restraining order expires, the victim's safety can be left up to chance. In the wake of Amy's death, her loved ones rallied around an idea that became their mission. They began advocating for a new legislative framework, a proposed change known as Amy's Law. The goal of Amy's Law was simple but crucial: to strengthen the protections available to victims of stalking and domestic violence, and to address the very gaps that left Amy exposed to her stalker's threats. So, what does Amy's Law propose? Amy's Law would set out a series of reforms, each carefully designed to fortify the existing protections for stalking and domestic violence survivors. The first and perhaps most significant measure would extend the duration of restraining orders, or allow them to last indefinitely, providing victims with security until they personally feel safe enough to lift them. With this change, the burden would shift away from the victims, giving them back control over their safety and ensuring that they wouldn't need to repeatedly renew the order, reliving trauma and potentially re-engaging with their abuser. Amy's Law also proposes the creation of a registry for stalkers, something similar to the sex offender registry, which would track repeat offenders and hold them accountable. This registry would enable victims, as well as law enforcement, to monitor individuals with histories of stalking, increasing oversight on those who may pose ongoing threats. Under Amy's Law, stricter guidelines would be put in place for enforcing restraining orders. Violations of these orders would be met with mandatory consequences, a stark contrast to the more lenient responses often seen today. And finally, Amy's Law aims to provide support for mandatory mental health evaluations and rehabilitation programs for convicted stalkers, with the hope that early intervention could prevent further escalation of abusive behavior. These proposals were born from the heartbreak of Amy's friends and family, who had witnessed her struggles firsthand. For them, this wasn't just about legislative change, it was personal. They could still hear her voice, see her smile, remember the way she fought to help others, and they knew she would have wanted to protect others, even in her death. Amy's brother, Chris, and her close friend, Robert Koshland, became particularly vocal about the reforms. Chris, who described the loss of his sister as a hole in our lives that can never be filled, explained that pushing for Amy's Law gave him purpose, a way to channel his grief into something meaningful. Amy's mother, Penny, and her father, Tom, joined the efforts as well, speaking to news outlets, signing petitions, and sharing their daughter's story with anyone who would listen. Together with Amy's friends, they spearheaded the Justice for Amy campaign, calling for state and federal lawmakers to take immediate action. Their mission was clear: to make Amy's Law a national standard, ensuring that no one else would face the same fate that Amy had. And the movement didn't stop with her family. Amy's clients, colleagues, and members of the mental health community rallied around her memory, sharing her story and supporting legislative change. Amy had been a therapist who fiercely advocated for the marginalized and underrepresented, and now people across the country were advocating for her. This grassroots movement became an unstoppable force, shining a spotlight on the urgent need for reforms. As the movement grew, it reached the ears of California lawmakers, who began drafting proposals and assessing ways to close the gaps in existing laws. However, the journey hasn't been easy. As Amy's family and friends pushed for reform, they encountered obstacles that have delayed progress. In 2020, COVID-19 disrupted legislative priorities, and bills tied to Amy's Law stalled amid broader public health concerns. But her family and supporters didn't give up. They continued to fight, reminding lawmakers that Amy's death wasn't an isolated tragedy but a symptom of a broken system. Today, the fight for Amy's Law is still alive and gaining traction. California lawmakers have shown interest in several of the proposed reforms, especially those related to extending restraining orders and enforcing stricter penalties for violations. Supporters of the law are hopeful that this legislation will gain the momentum it needs to pass, both in California and nationwide. Many believe that if Amy's Law becomes a reality, it could pave the way for a series of sweeping reforms that redefine how the U.S. handles stalking, harassment, and domestic violence cases. Despite the challenges, Amy's family remains undeterred. They continue to honor her memory, not only through legal reform but by raising awareness and sharing her story as a cautionary tale. Through social media, news segments, and speaking engagements, they are making sure Amy's voice is still heard. Amy's family and friends hope that one day, soon, Amy's Law will pass, marking a turning point for those living in fear of their abusers. They believe that by pushing for change, they are keeping her memory alive, making sure that her death was not in vain. As of now, legislative reform may still be in the works, but the impact of Amy's life and legacy is already felt across the nation. The fight for Amy's Law represents a broader movement, one that seeks to protect the vulnerable and give power back to those who feel powerless. Through the ongoing efforts of Amy's family, friends, and supporters, Amy's story has become a symbol of resilience, compassion, and the enduring power of advocacy. Her light has not dimmed. It shines brighter as the movement in her name continues to grow, offering hope to those who need it most. The road to justice is long, but Amy's story reminds us that change is possible. It reminds us that, even in the darkest of times, there is strength in coming together. Amy's Law represents that strength, and as her loved ones fight for its passage, they carry with them Amy's legacy, a legacy of courage, kindness, and unyielding hope for a safer world. As we reach the end of Amy Harwick's story, we're left not only with the grief of her tragic loss, but also with a deep sense of admiration for the life she lived and the impact she made. Amy was more than a renowned therapist. She was a healer, an advocate, a friend, and a cherished daughter and sister. She was someone who dedicated her life to the well-being of others, tirelessly working to guide people through their darkest moments, offering a light when they needed it most. Amy's work as a marriage and family therapist extended beyond the boundaries of traditional therapy. She championed those who often feel unseen, people in marginalized communities, individuals battling anxiety and depression, and those navigating the complex world of relationships. Her clients remember her as someone who understood, who listened without judgment, and who provided tools for them to rebuild their lives. For many, she was the first person who truly listened, the first person who truly cared. Amy's friend and client, Emily Sears, once described her as a one-of-a-kind therapist, someone who didn't just see clients but truly saw people. She treated each person as unique, with their own struggles and stories, always going the extra mile to help them on their journey to healing. Her ability to make others feel valued and supported was a rare gift, one that made a lasting difference in the lives of everyone she touched. Amy's legacy extends beyond her professional life. Her friends remember her as vibrant, fearless, and endlessly curious. Amy was the type of person who could be equally at home lecturing in a university classroom or performing at a rock concert. Her passions were diverse. She loved fire dancing, go-go dancing, and true crime stories. She was fascinated by the complexities of human nature, a curiosity that only fueled her compassion for others. Whether she was in front of a classroom, a camera, or a crowd of concert-goers, Amy lived life to the fullest, embracing every experience with a boldness that was uniquely her own. Her family describes her as a bright light, a force of nature with an unyielding drive to make a difference in the world. Her mother, Penny, recalls Amy's early curiosity and her constant desire to understand what makes people tick. From a young age, Amy wanted to help, to fix, and to heal. She was a passionate advocate for mental health awareness and was always open about the importance of seeking help, a message that resonated with thousands of people who watched her videos, read her book, or followed her on social media. For Amy's family, the loss is profound, a void that words can hardly describe. But as they work to preserve her legacy through their advocacy, they know that Amy's spirit lives on in the countless people she helped, in the lives she changed, and in the movements she inspired. Through their efforts, they are ensuring that Amy's mission of compassion and care will continue, giving her memory the voice that was so tragically taken from her. As we reflect on Amy's story, we're reminded of a crucial truth. Recognizing the signs of danger in relationships is essential, and taking action can make all the difference. Amy's case underscores the importance of taking threats seriously, of recognizing the risks of obsession and controlling behavior, and of understanding that some relationships, no matter how brief, can leave lasting scars. Amy did everything she could to protect herself. She sought restraining orders, took self-defense measures, and reached out to friends and family for support. Her actions were brave, and her instincts were right, but the system in place failed to protect her. The signs of a dangerous relationship aren't always obvious. Obsessive behavior, controlling actions, intimidation, and disregard for boundaries can all be red flags. If you or someone you know is in a relationship marked by any of these warning signs, remember that support is available. Recognizing the risks and speaking up is not only brave but essential. Amy's story reminds us that safety should never be compromised, that no one should feel trapped by fear, and that there are resources and communities out there ready to help. For those who may be listening and struggling in their own situations, please know you're not alone. There are people and organizations dedicated to helping you find safety and reclaim control of your life. The National Domestic Violence Hotline, local shelters, and counseling services are just a few of the resources available to anyone facing threats of abuse, violence, or stalking. Remember, seeking help isn't a sign of weakness. It's a powerful step towards a future free from fear. As we conclude today's episode, we carry Amy Harwick's story with us as a reminder of the importance of compassion, resilience, and awareness. We honor her legacy by continuing to speak out, by standing up for those who feel silenced, and by supporting the fight for better protections and resources for those facing abuse and harassment. Amy's spirit lives on through the lives she changed, the hearts she touched, and the enduring work of her loved ones. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. If you've made it to this point, drop a comment with the word "done," and we'll give you a personal shout-out to show our appreciation. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive in this murder and media frenzy. It was as fascinating for us to create as we hope it was for you to hear. If you found this episode thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where you can get early access to our content, have your questions answered directly, and enjoy exclusive members-only content. We'd love to know what you think about this case. Was justice truly served? Share your opinions in the comments below. We're always eager to hear your thoughts. For those wanting to explore more on true crime, we've included Amazon affiliate links to some of the books we referenced in our researches. Purchasing through the link won't cost you anything extra, but it will support the channel and help us continue bringing you more content. If you're craving even more, consider joining our Patreon community. As a member, you'll get access to the full script of this episode, exclusive book summaries, and even the complete set of images featured in this case, available for purchase in our Patreon store. This has been 22 Crime. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.